Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. Today we're going to continue our lecture on Chapter 13, the Central Nervous System, and in this video we're going to focus on the organization of the brain. So in the last section we looked at the embryonic development of the brain, and we stopped at how the brain looks at birth. And remember, at birth, the brain is going to resemble the adult brain because it has the major structures and the convolutions that are present in the brain. In this section, what I'd like to do is point out where specific regions of the brain are, so that when we get into the following sections where we describe each component and anatomy and function, we'll know where they are. Also, I want to talk about the directional terms that are used for the brain. They're going to be slightly different than what we are used to and what we learned in Chapter 1, because the brain folds in an odd direction, because we walk upright compared to other animals. So let's talk about these directions. Okay. So first, let's look at the directions of the brain. So the brain, as you're kind of going up, actually folds forward because we walk upright. Other animals aren't going to have this fold because they walk on all fours. So we're going to actually modify how we use our directional terms to make it a little bit easier to describe the brain and accommodate for this fold. So the front part of the brain, or the front of this fold, is called rostral. Rostral specifically means nose, so it's going to be closer to the nose of the body. And as we follow the curve down, it's going to go towards caudal. Caudal refers to tail. So when we're going along this curve and this fold, we're going to describe the brain rostral versus caudal. If you think of another animal such as a mouse, their brain isn't going to have this fold, and so this is going to be more of a straight line in a mouse. And again, this part of the brain would be the closest to its nose or its snout, so hence why we call it rostral. And this part of the brain would actually be closer to the tail of the mouse. So we kind of still use these terms when we're describing anatomical direction of the brain. So you may see me use rostral versus caudal throughout this lecture. Also, we're going to have the term ventral versus dorsal. Ventral is going to be closer to the front of the body or closer to the ventral cavity, and dorsal is going to be closer to the back or the spinal cord. And we're going to use these terms to describe more forward versus more back. You can see that ventral and dorsal is going to be a little bit easier to use because the terms inferior and superior and anterior and posterior can also be used, but you have to be careful exactly where on this fold you are using them. So just to be consistent, anything below the curve is going to be ventral. Anything above the curve is going to be dorsal. So that's the better way to describe the directional terms of the brain. When we go to looking at the structures of the brain themselves, let's kind of point out the major regions so that when we study them, we know where they're located. The part that we are used to seeing for the brain and have this big wrinkly part is called the cerebrum. The cerebrum will be responsible for processing a lot of sensory information, initiating motor information, and it's also going to have things such as our consciousness and our personality, helps us make judgment. So it has a lot of different functions. And those functions are localized to particular regions of the brain and different pathways within this cerebrum of the brain. Sandwiched between the two cerebral hemispheres is going to be the diencephalon. The diencephalon will have three subdivisions. The epithalamus, which is going to produce melatonin. The thalamus, which is going to process sensory information and all information kind of traveling to the cerebrum. And the hypothalamus, which is going to be a major part of controlling our homeostatic responses inside of our body. So it's going to maintain a dynamic internal balance in our body. The part that is below the diencephalon is going to be consisting of the brain stem, here in green. The brain stem is divided into three sections: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We'll get into their functions in a lot more detail in the following videos, but in general, these areas act as relay stations, connecting the spinal cord to the other regions of the brain, and also they will have unique functions as well. This large part over here is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is going to be responsible for controlling motor movements and integrating motor movements with sight, equilibrium, and other senses, so we can have smooth motion moving through our bodies. Also, it's going to be responsible for motor memory. So like when you ride a bike or you drive a car, you don't have to think about the individual details once you are used to it. And so the cerebellum is what's going to help us do that. So in the upcoming videos, we'll take the brain and break it down into pieces and really study the anatomy of each section and look at their individual functions. Before I move on, I do want to talk about the ventricles that are inside the brain. Remember when we talked about embryonic development and we said that there is a hollow space inside the nodal cord that will be continued into the structure of the brain and the spinal cord? Well, this is where that is going to occur. Over here, we're going to have different hollow areas inside the brain that are going to be filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and each of them are going to have a unique name. Oops. These two areas that are kind of a horseshoe shape is going to be the lateral ventricles, and this is a this is kind of a result of the telencephalon kind of rotating and folding backwards, and so you can see essentially how that movement occurred during brain development. So we call these the lateral ventricles. They're going to be deep inside the cerebrum. The middle one that is located here is called the third ventricle. These used to be called the first and second, so that's why this is called the third ventricle. And as a result of that, that third ventricle is going to be within the diencephalon. The lateral ventricles and the third ventricles are connected by the interventricular foramen, and this allows for cerebral spinal fluid to flow from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. We're going to have the fourth ventricle over here. The fourth ventricle is going to be connected to the third ventricle using the cerebral aqueduct. And eventually what will happen is the cerebral spinal fluid can actually leave and go and surround the brain using these lateral apertures. So the cerebral spinal fluid will be inside the brain and also surrounding the brain. We'll talk a little bit more about cerebral spinal fluid when we talk about how the brain is protected. And then the last little structure over here is the central canal. The central canal is a continuation of these ventricles down into the spinal cord. So those would be the ventricles. And over here you can see the lateral view, the third, the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and fourth ventricle. All right. So that concludes our video about the basic organization of the brain. In future sections, we're going to go into individual components of the brain and look at their structure and function. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.